information, please feel free to chat. We have staff on the back end who will help you out. So welcome. Thank you for joining us in the Family Voices of California 2020 Health Summit webinar series. We're thrilled that you're with us for today's webinar titled Education and Mental Health Challenges During COVID-19 for Families of Children with Special Health Care Needs. This is the second webinar in a two-part series. On Monday, part one of the series focused on mental health and stress-related challenges and concerns and is posted on the Family Voices of California website. And today we'll be addressing specific logistic questions that families encounter as they negotiate how to best support the educational development of their children through this time. And we'll be focusing on district offering, service provision, legal options that are available to them. So welcome. I'm going to talk a little bit about Family Voices of California, which is the organization that's bringing you this webinar. Family Voices of California is a statewide collaborative of parent-run centers that are working to ensure quality health care for children and youth with special health care needs. And I would also like to take a moment to express our deep gratitude for the organizations who sponsors this year's Health Summit. This would not be possible without their generous support. Last few housekeeping things. This webinar is going to be recorded and available on our website in a few days. And again, we're going to be answering questions at the end of the panelist presentations using the chat feature. So as the speakers are talking, if a question pops up, feel free to put it into the chat as you think of it, and then we will field them at the end. So thank you. I am Allison Stewart, and I'll be facilitating today's panel. I work at Support for Families as a Special Needs Inclusion Project Manager, and I'm going to introduce our wonderful speakers. We have Lilian Ansari, who is a special need parent advocate and the parent of 2 children with neurological conditions. She's been advocating passionately for the needs of her own children with special health care needs and for other families and children for the past 10 years. So we're thrilled to have Lilian with us. We have Cheryl Theis, who's an education advocate for the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, also known as DREDF. She has 5 children, 3 of whom have needed disability-related support at school, and is a foster, adoptive, and kinship parent. We have Suge Lee, who's the managing attorney of the Youth Practice Group at Disability Rights California. She represents children and youth with disabilities in the areas of special education and civil rights. Lindsay Jaffe is joining us. Lindsay is an occupational therapist who's currently working on her post-professional doctorate at Boston University, and she's been interning with Family Voices of California this summer and has been instrumental in helping us collect some of the data that we're going to use as part of today's presentation. And finally, we are honored to have a special guest speaker join us. Heather Calamisi is California's newly appointed Director of Special Education. Director Calamisi was formerly the Executive Director of Special Education for the Illinois State Board of Education. She's a strong advocate and champion for all students and brings excellent leadership and experience and knowledge of special education policy. Welcome, Director Calamisi.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and wonderful to know that there are thoughtful and engaging series around the challenges that face our community, and it's really, I think, positive and powerful to know that we have a community of committed and engaged practitioners, and also parents and students and families families that are really working together to solve some of our challenges that are unique to our community during distance learning during this time of the pandemic. And so I'm thrilled to be here to learn and engage, and certainly hope that this is, this is the first, but certainly not the last time that I will join you in partnership as we move forward throughout the year. Just a little bit about me. Yes, I most recently came from the Illinois State Board of Education and led the special education department there. In a previous life, I've been a special education paraprofessional. I've been a special education teacher. I've been a special education administrator prior to joining the state. So I take a unique lens always from a student perspective and from really a practitioner's perspective when working with some of the difficulties and challenges that we do face sometimes in our field. In terms of a state perspective, the role of the CDE has been and will always be to provide guidance and support to educational entities across the state, throughout the pandemic, obviously, regarding distance learning and other impacts to the education of our students. CDE, I feel it's our responsibility to continue to engage in conversations such as these with our community to learn more about what is occurring across the state. Also highlight best practices, and I think with that, fill the gaps with guidance and support. And so I think this is a unique opportunity for me to really listen and engage and dialogue, because I think that it, again, like I've stated before, it is the responsibility of the CDE to respond, to provide that guidance, to provide that support so that students with identified disabilities have the supports and services that they need and require to access the curriculum. I think it's really important to acknowledge that the pandemic provides a unique challenge, just in the sense of that there really is no one size fits all model in terms of how we address some of these barriers. And so it really has required the CDE to deepen our partnerships with across the state in terms of our statewide systems of supports, our parent centers and other partners to really, again, listen, engage, provide meaningful guidance as well. And this includes the multiple array and diversity of learners across our state, and really looking to determine, what are those best practices that are being implemented, and are they successful? And really, for me, is hoping to engage in some peer-to-peer learning across districts across the state as well, so that we can continue to learn from one another. And really at the heart of this issue for me is really about the critical relationships between state agencies, parents, school, and community. And I really do and firmly believe that, as I've stated before, we will get through this. However, it will take all of us to problem solve and come to the table ready to really have a deep and honest discussion about what's working, what's not working, and what do we really need to change in the system, so that this is a time of growth for our students and for our families, and not a time of loss and desperation. And so I am committed, relatively new here at the CDE, but certainly committed to ensuring that we remain focused on the target and really utilize and really find the ways to continue to help our children thrive throughout the state as well. So looking forward to listening again and learning, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Director Calamisi. We really appreciate you giving us your time today. Before we launch into our other panelists, we'd like to do a poll to get to know a little bit about you as our audience. So if you'll take some time to fill out the poll that has popped up on your screen, we're going to share the results in a few minutes. So our first presenter is going to be Lindy Jaffe, and she's going to be talking a little bit about survey results from a survey that we sent out to families earlier this year. Lindy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Back in July, when we started conceiving of these workshops, we sent out a survey to families to better understand the range of experiences people were having with distance learning and how we could best support families through these stressful times. We got 360 responses to our survey, which was amazing. Thank you, everybody. And in that, we found that with regards to the educational component, 71% of families reported that their IEP goals were put on hold in the spring. And of those families, of the total families that responded, an additional 21%, so not of the 71%, in addition to the 71%, 21% reported resulting skill regression from the IEP goals being put on hold. So that was a huge percentage of families who were struggling. I don't know that this will come as a surprise to anybody. 87% reported severe reduction of school-based services, and 88% reported a significant impact on either the child or the family or both from the decreases in service provision. So really, there were very significant repercussions in the spring to the shelter in place in terms of the educational component. I wish I could share all of the comments that speak to both the frustrations and the advocacy challenges that people were, and I imagine are still having. I pulled two of them because I felt that they gave a good starting picture into some of what people were saying. I am but one person trying to accomplish the work of a team of 6 or more. I do in-home therapy with my daughter, but I lack the expertise to create a program that will help her truly progress towards any of her defined goals. And a second one. Speech was on Zoom, but it was difficult for my son's SLP to hear him. OT was on Zoom, but I had to be a one-to-one aide. It was essentially homeschooling, but the district is getting the funds. I pulled this slide because it shows the range of emotions around returning to school in person. It's not a surprise, and if you can, hopefully everybody can read it well enough. Basically, we just asked families if at the point at which we sent it out, we didn't know whether there was going to be distance learning in the fall or if people were going to be able to go back to school in person. So we were trying to get a sense of people's hopes, whether they intended, if there was in-person school, whether they would go to school or not, if they weren't sure, or only if there were special circumstances. For example, if it was just special ed, would they go under those circumstances? So the slide shows the range of emotions around returning to school in person. And it's not a surprise that there's no one size fits all for our community. This is very much what Director Calamisi was alluding to. For many, distance education just doesn't work. The kids can't access it. The demands on the parents are too high. For others who have higher levels of risk for either the reasons, medical risk or family risk, it's just not worth going back to in person. So flexibility becomes key, and finding the tools to advocate for ourselves is essential. On our end, Family Voices took your voices and suggestions to the California Department of Education. We're currently researching the appropriate legislative committees to do the same. It's our wish that the strength of your stories will support increasing educational flexibility for our families so that life just becomes a little easier for you during this incredibly stressful time. We hope that you find this webinar helpful in your path forward. We wish you health and peace.
Thank you very much, Lindy, for sharing that information. We appreciate all the work you did on that for us. Allie, if you could launch the poll results, that would be great so we can see what people are saying. Great. So it looks like we have a nice mix of people coming to us that are identifying as parents and caregivers or professionals, and or people are identifying as having special needs themselves. And I'm happy to see that over half of you are excited to be learning. And I would like to send out some support and warm thoughts to the folks that are still feeling anxious or overwhelmed. You're not alone in feeling that during this time, and hopefully you'll be able to get some information and strategies that will help as a result of the rest of this webinar. So thank you for participating in the poll. And we're going to hear now from Lilian, who is a parent and a parent advocate. Lilian?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I can definitely speak to the anxiety. So I am parent to two children with special health care needs. I have a 15-year-old with autism, learning disabilities, anxiety, sleep disorder, and a number of other things. And I have an 11-year-old little girl with a genetic disorder called tuberous sclerosis that causes developmental delays, epilepsy, and autism, as well as other complications. And anyone that has ever had a child with an IEP and that has had to go through the quagmire of special education and knows how daunting the task is to develop a robust IEP for your child. I worked with a whole team of people, worked really hard to have the right goals and the right services and the right placement for my children. And on any given week, about 15 different therapists and teachers supported my daughter. 8 different professionals supported my son. And now, instead of the 23 people that supported both my children each week, it's just come down to me having to support them. And all of those goals and services are basically gone because obviously I can't do the work of 23 professionals. I'm not trained to be a therapist or a teacher. My children don't respond to me as a teacher or a therapist. My daughter, who is more impacted by her disability, doesn't understand what a virus is. She thinks it's a person. She keeps saying, coronavirus says stay home. She has no idea why we have to, the schools are closed, why she can't go to the park, and she absolutely does not respond to me as a teacher or her therapist. She's also, so basically because of all that, I've had to stop working. I've also worked very hard to build a private practice as a special needs advocate, and now there's really not a lot of work being done. I'm just working really hard to survive and keep the kids going. My daughter also is immune compromised, and she's at risk of very serious complications if she does get infected with COVID. And even when the kids do go back, the first round of kids go back, she will not be going back. And my son also won't be going back because obviously we don't want him to get infected or bring anything home either. So I really don't know if there's an end to any of this for us anytime soon. For years, my 2 priorities for my daughter were to learn to read and have a friend. We've had to adjust expectations just like a lot of other families with special needs children do. And it really just came down to those 2 priorities for me, for us, for her, learn to read and have a friend. And at 11 years old, she was finally learning to read. And now, because of shelter in place and distance learning, that's all pretty much gone. She's regressing in both areas, socially and academically. She basically cannot access distance learning at all without 100% support. Even then, she's very, very resistant to doing Zoom classes. She has sensory issues. She has the need for sensory-based OT, which is kind of more hands-on, which is just not doable on Zoom. Her goals for speech are mostly social, which is also very difficult. The kids just get up and leave, basically. It's really hard to keep them engaged. Having to log on and off several times a day also is proven to be very, very difficult. She has trouble switching gears and with transitions, and having to log on and off several times a day is very, very stressful. And some days we just give up, honestly. I don't have the stomach to go through this over and over again. I don't want to put her through it. Some days we just log off and have her color for the rest of the day and maybe read with me. And that's the best we can do. My son is less impacted by his disability. He's also at a non-public school. My daughter is in a public school. And it's a very different experience with him at a private school. He's been able to get most of the services, and possibly because he's also less impacted by his disability, it's been a lot easier for him. He likes technology and he likes having the control over being able to take a break whenever he wants to, or mute himself or mute others when he needs to. However, he's definitely also regressed socially. As I mentioned, he does have autism, and it's that's a huge area of need for him. That's been difficult. And his anxiety is also through the roof because of the virus. So even though he has better access, it's definitely still, distance learning has definitely impacted him in a negative way too. As a family, of course, anyone that's going through this can tell you, it's, as I've said before, a lot of the families are struggling, whereas a lot of the special needs families, especially if you have more than one child with a disability, or if you have a young child, even without a disability, we are just downright suffering. It's a lot of us feel like even before the pandemic, we were running on fumes, and the only break we ever got was when the kids went to school, or when we had a therapist at home to support us. And little did we know it was going to get a lot harder. And now that that's gone, we have to shepherd our children through a pandemic and through all the different therapies and academics and social and all the different supports they need, like personal hygiene and feeding and sleeping and everything else that our kids need. And it's not really humanly possible for one person or even two people. So we've had to, once again, change expectations and pick our battles. And there are days when our focus is just to keep kids alive and happy. But it's definitely been difficult. We've had some luck with interventions we've done or things we've tried recently, just forming a pod, what we call a germ pod, with another family of child with a special need. That's been helpful. And looping in one solid support person to our family that happens to be also immune compromised, and that way we can trust him to be, her to be very, very careful. That's been, even though it's still risky, without her, it just honestly wouldn't be survivable. And as I mentioned, we've also changed expectations. And if my children read most days, I'm happy. We're not trying to do much else beyond that. So it's been difficult with no end in sight. But, you know, just like everybody else, we're doing the best we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allison. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Lilian, for sharing your family's story and some of the strategies that you've come up with. I appreciate that. I just want to remind people that we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. And as questions come up, if you will go ahead and put them in the chat right now, we'll be able to then field them later on. So you don't need to wait until Q&A to put your questions in the chat. You can go ahead and enter them as they come up for you. So with that, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Theis. Welcome, Cheryl.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lilian, for putting the frame around what we at DREDF, and I know many other organizations across the state, are hearing about the reality for so many families right now. And for all of you out there who are struggling, we hear you. I think we all, everyone who's participating today and across the state, our leadership is recognizing that this is very hard on all students. There are some families who are finding it that it works better, but the vast majority are finding that it creates real burdens. But for children with disabilities, the burdens are just exponentially harder in many cases. So I want to go through some basic advocacy strategies and tips, and I want to be clear as I do that my partner and colleague here in this presentation, Suge, will be from Disability Rights California, will be talking more about the legal side of things. So I just want to focus on what the heck can you do right now with all of this. Before I start, I just want to say that I am honored to work at the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. DREDF has been working incredibly hard to manage the issues that are arising for all kinds of people with disabilities during this pandemic. We are a national disability civil rights organization, and we have a vision where all people live full and independent lives without discrimination. So one of the issues that keeps coming up again and again in the calls that I'm taking in the Parent Center, which I'll explain in a minute, have to do with, is it discrimination when everybody else's child can access, but mine just can't? You know, is this equal access? What do we do about that? So these are just the things that I think we're struggling with on a larger scale. Next slide. So just so you know, when these important laws that we're talking about today were put in place, especially the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, there was a recognition among many advocates, people with disabilities, parents of children with disabilities, that rights are really only as good as your ability to use them. And you have to understand them in order to use them. And so funding was set aside for a network of parent training and information centers across the country. So no matter where you are, there is a parent center, at least one in every state. And so I just wanted to make sure you had the link, because you may or may not be part of the area that DREDF covers, but just so you know, there is someone in every state. And if you can't find that, you can reach out to me and I will make sure you find out who your parent training and information center is. So our job is to help you participate, and this is the big word, meaningfully. You're not a guest at these meetings. I'm not going to limit my comments today to just students with IEPs, because I know that many children with special health care needs may have a 504 plan or may just have a more informal plan. And so sometimes the answers are specific to what kind of plan your child has, but we're trying to help empower all of you with some basic advocacy strategies. So the Parent Training and Information Centers, everything we do is free. We're not giving you legal advice. So if that's what you need, we can't help with that. But what we can do is tell you, what are your rights? How can you use them? How can you participate effectively? And also, how can you help work to change the system for everybody in the state? And I'm going to come back to that. Next slide. Okay, so just a couple of quick legal pieces of information. You know, I think a lot of us feel, I think in my introduction, I failed to say that I have 5 children, and I've lived through many a 504 meeting and many an IEP. And I've been doing this, gosh, I came to DREDF like almost 15 years ago now, and I still can cry at an IEP meeting. I still find myself extremely stressed out, and I do this work for a living. So I hear you loud and clear when you talk about the level of stress you're under. But let's just start with some of the basic rights. So some children, in order to go to school, even online, need to have access. So they need barriers removed so they can participate in their education like people who don't have disabilities do, like students who don't have disabilities do. And that's really the purpose of 504. And so a lot of questions have come into our Parent Training and Information Center at DREDF around, hey, is this still in place? Like, my child had accommodations that removed barriers, helped my child access during the, before time, during the times when we were actually meeting in person. And now someone from my school is telling me that this doesn't matter, or this isn't something that has to be followed during distance learning. And the reality is that, yes, if you're providing education for anybody, you need to make sure that you make it as accessible as possible for everybody. So Some of these issues have to do with 504 issues, and that means that, you know, this child can't access. That raises questions about discrimination. If other students can benefit and my student can't because of their disability, just like because of their race, because of their gender, etc., then there may be a barrier around that. A couple of things I just want to remind you of. One, and I have some examples in a minute, accommodations that are specific to distance learning certainly can be provided during this time. I'll give you an example. My own 14-year-old, the last one at home, yes, of my 5 kids, cannot tolerate, has a very significant anxiety disorder. He cannot tolerate having the camera on. And I know how he feels because I'm on here with you guys today, and it's really odd to be seeing myself on the screen. And so that accommodation is not something that was in his plan before we started doing distance learning, but it's absolutely essential to him right now. So we've had to brainstorm ideas. So those kinds of things, like how do you use your paraprofessional or your aid support when you're online, those kinds of things have been real challenges. And the child is still entitled to that help if they need it to access like everybody else. Next slide. And then of course we have a group of students who not only are protected by 504, but also need specialized academic instruction and case management and other kinds of support. And those are the students who have an individualized education plan, an IEP. Again, this isn't a legal class. We're not going to go into the great details about it, but just so you know, it's a federal education law. And it says that if a student meets one of the 13 definitions in the law about what makes a student eligible, and also because of that disability needs specialized academic instruction and support in order to benefit from their education, then they get an IEP. For the purposes of today, I just want to emphasize that the acronym is really important. So the I means it's individualized to your child's unique needs, even now. One size doesn't fit all. Education means that we're not just talking about a child's academics, we're talking about a child's education. And that brings me back to Lilian's point, you know, that goal of learn to read and have a friend. Having a friend is just as educational for a lot of kids as learning to read, because it predicts so much about long-term employment access, quality of life, how to get help, how to advocate for what you need, and so on. So the bottom line in terms of IEP right now is that during distance learning, students are still entitled to receive a free, appropriate, public education. They may have to receive that in a different way, but their services and support should be as close to what they were before as reasonably possible. So that's where, of course, there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of challenges. And I think it's important to say too, because for the people out there who are educators, many of whom also have our own kids struggling, it's not like we don't have teachers and case managers and other people who have young children or children with disabilities at home. I think it's put a lot of strain on everybody because we're trying to, basically what's the saying? We're trying to build the plane while we're flying it. We're trying to figure this out and educate people at the same time, and it's extremely challenging. Next slide. So let me just talk about some of the challenges, and your poll really, and Lindy, thank you so much for summarizing it. I actually had a chance to review it, and it was really heart-wrenching, a lot of what I read. The challenges that we're hearing about and that you captured too, first of all, a little bit of good news, because for a period of time until just recently, like this week, the school districts and charter schools weren't obligated to meet some of the critical timelines. So for students who might need services and support, assessments were not being done because it was really hard for schools to figure out how to do that remotely. As of this week, and Suge will talk more about this, that those timelines are back in place. So that's a huge relief for a lot of us, because so many kids have literally been in a queue that just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it doesn't really benefit anyone that when schools reopen, that we would have a flood of kids who would come back and then need to be pulled out constantly in order to be reevaluated. So that's good news. Other issues we've heard about are things like, what does inclusion mean? You know, my student used to be included in the regular classroom, and now they're included on Zoom, except they're at home. And does the school district still have to do that? And what about the fact that the only way they could participate was if they had an aide to help them? And so that's been an issue. We all know that technology has been a big issue, and a really difficult one. I mean, at DREDF, we had a family recently who the family was unsheltered, and yet, you know, the district said, well, we want to make sure you can still access, so here's a Chromebook and a hotspot for your car. And that's really difficult. You know, that child is expected to sit in the car and access. And then we had the fires and the smoke, and, you know, it's just so difficult to make any of that work. And then, of course, there's family needs and situations. So many of us are still trying to, well, I think all of us are working. Let me start by saying that. But some of us have also our regular out of the house jobs are now in home. All of our family's responsibilities are present, and we're dealing with all of the issues around helping our kids access education. Behavior and mental health concerns are big. There's concerns about regression, and I wanted to define it just because I think we tend to use a lot of language and we forget to use definitions. Regression means that your child is losing skills. Not only are they not making progress toward their IEP goals, they're actually going backwards. Maybe their social skills were improving, now they haven't had any social interaction and they're less and less able to engage and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of questions about what are we going to do once we come back to school to make this up to kids. The fancy word for that is compensatory education. And then I think, you know, a lot of families are just literally crying out for help. You know, if I'm going to do this, I need training. I don't know how to program this AAC device so my child can communicate. I don't know what the behavior supports that you used were, and, you know, and how to implement them in a home environment. All of these things all contribute to this enormous level of stress. So let's talk about some things you can do to deal with all that. Next slide. So first of all, just some basic advocacy essentials. And Lilian, I know this is the stuff that you live by too. It's really important to remember that schools are serving many, many children. They're hearing from many families. Teachers are dealing with all kinds of different issues. It's always best, even if you have a verbal conversation, to try to write it down and keep a record of it so that you can remind everyone what agreements were. You can say, hey, remember I brought this up a month ago and you said you would do this and that and so on. So write it. You can say it, but write it too, and always make sure things are in writing. I wanted to point you to our website. There's a few places where I'll do that, but our sample letters and forms, we have a variety of sample letters that you can use for different situations, including like just how do you write to a school district to say, hey, I'm worried about how distance learning is going. It's not working for my child. You always want to make sure you send things in a way where you know they were received. And we're all relying a lot on email right now. So I've been encouraging people that if they don't get a response to at least check back in and say, or even through phone, did you get my email? Can you confirm that you received it? Because previously, we might have sent things in different ways or even hand delivered them. Always request that answers to problems or questions that you have also are in writing. It doesn't have to be in a formal way. Some situations require that. But in general, you know, I always tell families, you know, if you're raising a concern and you're asking for help solving it, say, you know, I'd like to hear from you within the next 5 days. Not because there's necessarily some big legal hook that you can hang your hat on there, but because it sets some kind of deadline and creates a priority. And then you yourself can take your calendar and mark it and say, I'm going to check back in if I don't get an answer in X amount of time. Right now, keeping examples and logs and videos of things that your child's doing is really important. This has been an ongoing source of frustration for us at DREDF, and I think for a lot of families too, which is schools are saying, well, we can't really monitor how your child's doing unless we see it ourselves. And so we're saying, you know, if the parent is the one that's delivering the educational program, then you need to see and hear, you know, the videos, the work samples, the pictures, the reports that they're giving you, because that's giving you important information about how this child is doing. Next slide. So I wanted to give you, I'm not going to go through all these. I just wanted to give you some examples of some of the distance learning accommodations that we've been seeing work for a lot of kids. So sometimes, I didn't even know what the word breakout room meant 6 months ago. And now, like, just ask me, I have all this technical expertise. So, breakout rooms are when kids are in a group with their teacher, and maybe the teacher wants to divide them into small groups to go talk about something they're reading or doing or whatever. So for some of our kids, having breakout rooms where there's a para educator or an aide or a special ed teacher there to help them have been really helpful. Having the camera off at times, captioning, large print, all those kinds of things that make visual access or auditory access possible for kids, they need to be provided. Some of the things that were happening before, like extra time for assignments and tests, are still perfectly reasonable during distance learning. And there's some other examples there. Next slide. Some issues are coming up around attendance. Families have been saying, I felt a little bit threatened because the school said that because we weren't logging in, that we might get in trouble for our child not attending. So attendance is required. It wasn't really monitored carefully in the spring. But you can ask how it's being measured. Is it that the child just needs to log in to the Zoom class, but if they don't finish, they're still considered in attendance? Are there special reasons why for your child attendance during like the live session wouldn't work? A lot of families, if you're working outside the home, you're not there to help a child log in and make sure that things are going well. We're also hearing, unfortunately, and the stories have been coming in across the country, of discipline issues even online. And so, what do you do when a child is like making silly faces or getting up or being restless or decides to do a little dance or maybe says a bad word during Zoom class? And, is it really, are we really going to just implement the same rules around discipline that we did before? And a lot of the positive behavior plans and supports that worked in school could certainly be implemented at home if people work together to solve the problem. And then the other question that we just want to make sure everybody's thinking about is, if your child coming back to school is going to be more difficult because of their disability, because wearing a mask triggers a lot of sensory issues, because social distancing is a concept they don't understand, because they have emotional or behavioral needs where when they're really dysregulated, they're going to struggle a lot to meet expectations, then those are things to bring up with your team now to start thinking about. How could we have some services to help my child start learning to wear a mask, to help my child understand what 6 feet of social distancing is, and so on. Next slide. Take a look at the time. Okay, so what do you do when things aren't working? I think that's why a lot of you logged in today, and I don't have any magic solutions for you. I think generally we want to try to solve things at the local level with the school whenever we can. So here's some basic places to start. First of all, like, what's the problem? So a lot of times what parents will do is say, nothing's working, this isn't working, but they aren't being specific enough about what's getting in the way. So, is it that your child's not getting enough of the services that they need? Is it that they just can't access them because they're not being provided in person? Why is that? Can you give some examples? Sometimes there's technology barriers. My child can access because, I've got 5 kids and 1 computer, and you're doing school all at the same time for all of them. Sometimes it's the family situation. Whatever it is, try to think hard about how you can identify it. And then next slide. And then think about, okay, what can I do to solve this? Let's start with the people who are closest to the situation. So the first thing you can do is put your concerns in writing and share them with someone like a case manager or a teacher or whatever. But often bringing that IEP or 504 team together. And if your child doesn't have either of those yet, just bringing a school team together. Some schools call them SST meetings or student success meetings. But bringing a team of people together who care about this child and are going to problem solve together is the first step. So I wanted to make sure you had a sample letter. I said a minute ago, document and monitor work samples. So make sure that you have evidence about what the problem is. If you couldn't say anything, what could you show somebody to show them what the problem is? Getting evaluation, even if it's outside evaluation if necessary, contacting experts, using your parent rights, calling us at your Parent Training and Information Center. And this is my new favorite saying, don't get mad, get data, right? So don't let your frustration and your overwhelm get you to the point where you start blowing up relationships with the people on the ground who are trying to help. Try to think about how you can create data and evidence of what's going on for your child to help tell your child's story, and help the team understand where the struggles really are. Next slide. Just going to wrap up here. Remember to be careful about what you sign. Even during this time, you know, when you sign, you don't want to necessarily sign something that permanently changes an IEP or 504 plan if it's really just a temporary change. So you want to be careful, and you want to make sure you understand what you're signing. If you bring problems to the school district and they say, okay, here's the solution, sign here, make sure you understand what it is they're proposing, including getting your language interpretation needs met, having things translated. You wouldn't sign any other legal document without understanding it, I hope, and you certainly shouldn't sign any of these. Next slide. So as far as regression goes, I just wanted to say that here's some ideas about how you can document where you're seeing your child go backwards. Is it their motor skills, their social skills, their emotional, mental health skills, their communication, their behavior, or their academics? Try to think about, like, where does this problem that we're having fit? And maybe it fits into a variety of different categories. Understand your rights, because as Suge is going to tell you in just a minute, these questions about how do we put kids back in the position they would have been in are going to be critical moving forward, but we need to know what the loss the child suffered was, and that's going to depend on documentation and data. And I think I'm just going to wrap up here in the interest of time and let Suge take over from here. So why don't we just advance through these last slides. I do have some resources for you at the end, and I wanted to say that there are also really important opportunities even now to get involved at the local, county, SELPA, or state level to help address some of these problems systemically. So there's information about how to get involved and be part of the solutions as well. Suge, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Cheryl. So you really set me up really perfectly to talk about, our next, the topic that I'm going to cover, which is, what do you do if you can't resolve things at the level of the IEP and you're starting to think about, taking things to the next level, pursuing some kind of appeal or complaint. And I think, I think as everybody has kind of talked about, this coronavirus crisis has really highlighted, the places in which there is inequality, there is discrimination, and certainly, special education, discrimination, disability discrimination is certainly one of those areas when it comes to education. So next slide, please. So I want to introduce Disability Rights California a little bit. We are what's called the Protection and Advocacy agency for the state. We receive funding and a federal mandate under U.S. law to protect and advocate for individuals with disabilities in the state of California. Our mission is to advocate, educate, investigate, litigate, to advance the rights, dignity, equal opportunities, and choices for all people with disabilities. So special education is really only one of the areas that we practice in. We have a lot, we address a lot of issues that impact, children and adults with disabilities. You may be familiar with some of the other departments at DRC. If you've ever worked with the Office of Clients' Rights Advocacy, or with one of our patients' rights advocates, there's a lot of different types of advocacy that we do throughout the state, and we're located statewide. We have offices located throughout the state. Our major hubs are LA, Sacramento, San Diego, Fresno, and Oakland. We also have other satellite offices, but we are really a statewide organization. Next slide. So the kind of main question is what rights still apply during the coronavirus crisis? And I think one thing to really keep in mind is that for the most part, all of the laws that would typically apply, before we were in lockdown, still apply. And so no parts of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act have been waived. Nothing as far as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act were waived. And so everything still applied for the most part. And under both IDEA and Section 504, students with disabilities were entitled to a free, appropriate public education. If you're talking about a special education student, that would have included least restrictive environment, and then also special education instruction and related services. And so there's no point where people said, okay, well, special education instruction's off the table, this related service, therapy or anything like that is no longer on the menu. All those things continue to apply. Accommodations for both 504 students and special education students, of course, continue to apply and probably had to be modified as Cheryl was describing, given the new distance learning experience that most students were having. There has been a recent change to the law that was passed earlier this summer, and that was Senate Bill 98. It was basically a budget bill that had certain provisions about education contained in it. I think the one that's probably most relevant to folks who may be attending this call is the need to have some kind of plan for how special education services would be delivered in case there are emergency conditions. And if those conditions lasted more than 10 days. And emergency conditions could be something, a pandemic like COVID, it could be fire, flooding, something that prevents students from attending school. Now, though that doesn't need to be made part of the IEP right away, it does need to be put in place if you have an initial IEP that's being developed, or by the time you get to your next IEP meeting, annual IEP meeting. It doesn't mean that you can't discuss it before that, but by the time you get to your next annual IEP meeting, there should be something in there involving kind of what emergency services would kick into place when there are emergency conditions. And I think one of the really important things is all IEP and 504 plans must be based on students' unique and individual needs. You really shouldn't have to settle for some kind of one-size-fits-all program if it really doesn't meet your child's needs. Next slide, please. I think one of the questions we've been getting a lot is, what do we do if I have a child that needs in-person services? And I think one thing to keep in mind, because I've heard a lot of parents telling me, school districts telling me this, school districts telling me that, is that there's nothing in the law that prohibits in-person services from being provided if students need in-person services in order to receive a free, appropriate public education. In fact, there is California Department of Education guidance that says if you're providing these kinds of specialized supports to a vulnerable group, like kids with disabilities, with intense health needs, that those providers should be considered essential workers. Another kind of question that I've been getting is assessments. School district is saying they can't provide in-person assessments. They are saying, you either have to do a virtual assessment. I think that really depends on what the evaluation is. At the end of the day, like the professional, the psychologist, the speech therapist is going to be in the best position to know whether an in-person or virtual assessment is really going to be valid given the different testing that they're doing, and then also whether it's going to meet that child's needs. But again, there's nothing that says, there's just no way anybody can provide an assessment in person ever. And then one thing that is good to know is that over the summer, late in the summer, the California Department of Public Health did release guidance saying that school districts can operate small group, or what they're calling cohort education, little pods basically of up to 14 students and 2 adults, where they're not going to be mixing with any other student. Everybody's going to kind of keep to this small cohort to provide in-person special education instruction and services. So they basically say, issued this guidance saying this is allowed, the Department of Public Health. And then it's been really up to individual school districts and counties to decide whether this is something that they're going to offer. And so I know that there are districts out there who are allowing small cohort education for students with disabilities to provide special education services. And I also know that there are groups out there who are advocating at school board meetings with school superintendents to try to get that in their own school districts, or going to their IEP meetings and advocating for those kinds of things. Next slide. So what are parents' rights during the COVID crisis? So again, like I said earlier, all the federal requirements under IDEA have always applied. Things like you get an IEP meeting within 30 days of making a request. Things like you get an IEP, a triennial assessment in IEP every 3 years. You get an annual IEP every year. Those are all requirements that continue to exist. And so if your school district has delayed a triennial or delayed an annual IEP, in my kind of, my assessment of that situation, the school district is out of compliance with special education requirements. There has been a lot of talk about assessments and records requests being delayed. And I think this is it's very fiddly. You kind of have to get into the weeds a little bit. But there was a state bill, Senate Bill 117, that was passed early this year in March, that basically said certain requirements that only existed in state law were waived. And one of those requirements was when parents make a request for a special education evaluation, they're supposed to get an assessment plan within 15 days. And then another requirement was if special education students or parents of special education students request records, that you were supposed to get them within 5 school days. And basically, it really is limited to the 15 school days for the assessments between when you make the request and when you receive the assessment plan. If you already signed an assessment plan, then they still had to provide, complete the assessment within 60 days. That 60-day requirement still applied. That being said, SB 117 did end up delaying people. But, I think that school districts were relying on 117 to say, okay, no new assessments are going to move forward from this point out. But they kind of forgot that IDEA still applied, and they still had an obligation to, identify kids who may be special education eligible under their child find obligation, that, they're still required to do triennial assessments if triennial assessments were due. So, and also, I also think, to the extent that kids need assessments in order to, in order to determine what a FAPE is, that to the extent that the school districts were delaying that indefinitely is very problematic. And I think SB 117 was really passed, in my opinion, to allow for some flexibility. It even says in SB 117, we encourage school districts to still try to do assessments. It was really not saying it's extended indefinitely. My thought is, from reading the text, that it was really to build in some flexibility, but it hasn't been interpreted that way. And so if you have experienced this, your child may be eligible for compensatory education. I would certainly make the argument, if I were advocating for a student, that was the case. And then, you still have all your procedural procedural rights, things like right to language interpretation and translation. And then, as we're going to go into a little bit more detail in this presentation, the right to file an appeal or complaint. Next slide, please.
Suge, this is Ali. We had a request if you could just slow down the pace just a little bit for interpretation.
Okay.
Thank
Yes,
you.
of course. Sorry about that. I feel like I have a lot to get through, so I will try to slow down. A lot of these advocacy best practices were really covered in Cheryl's presentation. Things like making sure everything is in writing, keeping service logs and work samples, and making sure everything, making sure that you are asking the district to respond in writing. And it's important that you are following these best practices. For one, because it makes you a much more effective IEP advocate, right? If you're asking for the district to respond to you about a decision and provide their decision in writing and explain the reasons why, they have to put that in writing. And so it might make them kind of think twice about their decision or how they're going to explain their decision. But they're also really important because it helps you build a record upon which you can file an appeal, because so much of what happens when you file some kind of appeal or complaint is what you have in writing. In a situation where there's a he said, she said, and there's no writing to kind of back you up, it really puts you at a disadvantage. And so that's really the reason why some of these kind of best practices with regard to IEP advocacy are really important. Next slide, please. So, okay, I'm going to talk about, several appeal options under kind of state, mechanisms, federal agencies, and then also kind of locally through your local school district. Next slide. So the four categories of appeals that I'm going to go over today. The first is a request for due process / fair hearing with the Office of Administrative Hearings. This is really limited to those students who are bringing claims under special education, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's really not something that's available if you have a 504 plan. Similar with the compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. That is really something that you can go to CDE first if you are a special education student. And so if you're a 504 student, you kind of have to go through a different complaint process before you can appeal up to CDE, which I'm going to talk about at the bottom of this list. There's the Office of Civil Rights complaint with the U.S. Department of Education. That's a discrimination complaint, and that can apply to, both kind of 504 Americans with Disabilities Act discrimination complaints, but it also, to a certain extent, folds in special education requirements. And then uniform complaint procedures, it's also called the UCP with the school district, and you might sometimes hear that referred to as a Williams complaint. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more detail later. Next slide. All right, so due process is probably the most involved out of all of these procedures, because it is the most similar to kind of the court type of proceedings that you may see on TV, where you have two parties sitting at two different tables in front of a judge. You're calling witnesses and asking the witnesses questions. So it's the most formal out of all of the procedures that we're going to be talking about today. As I said before, this is really for special education issues. And it's when you have some kind of disagreement with the school district about your child's eligibility, placement, program needs, instruction and related services, and if you're seeking compensatory education. Your claims for due process can go back up to 2 years. And so, you really shouldn't, limit your, there's some cases where you can go back further than 2 years. But, for the most part, 2 years. So you really do want to kind of look back a little bit to see all the different violations that may have occurred over the past 2 years, just so that you're making sure if you are filing a due process complaint that you're getting everything that you potentially could get some remedy for. One thing that's important with due process is you can have a motion for what's called a stay put. And so that means while the due process case is pending before the Office of Administrative Hearings, if you make this motion for your child to stay put, they can't change your child's placement in services until there is a decision by the administrative law judge. And that's really important if the school district is proposing to change placement and services for your child right away, and you really just want to put a hold on things until a judge can look at it and make a final decision. There are processes for resolution that are built into the due process procedures. One is a resolution session, which should be happening within 15 days of you filing your due process complaint. The other, and that's just you and the school district together. There's no neutral person in the middle, just trying to figure things out and seeing if you can resolve the issue. There's also a slightly more formal procedure called mediation. That's where you have a neutral person. It's usually an administrative law judge who's not going to be looking at your case, where you can meet with a neutral and try to resolve the issues that way. A lot of cases do resolve when you get to mediation. One thing to note is that there is an option for what's called mediation only. That means you're filing a complaint with the Office of Administrative Hearings, but you're saying, I don't want a hearing. I just want to have a mediation with a neutral administrative law judge to see if we can figure things out. And so that's kind of an in-between option that some families like to go with. And so if you have a resolution session within 30 days of filing, the OAH decision must issue about 45 days after. So typically, these cases, they take about 2 months or more. That's just kind of the typical time frame for when you can get a decision. Next slide.
Suge, we're getting quite a few questions, and we're coming close to time.
Okay.
So go ahead and finish next slide, and then if we can go to questions, that would be great.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm going to try to go really fast. All I want to say here is that there have been a couple recently promising coronavirus-related due process decisions and orders that have been issued by the Office of Administrative Hearings recently. And so, I'm going to skip this, but I just want you to know that some of these cases involving coronavirus are coming through, and we are seeing a couple decisions that have been very favorable to parents. And so, we're hoping to see a continuing trend of that moving forward. Next slide. Compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. It's really for situations where the district fails to implement the IEP or violate special education procedures. And these can include like multiple student complaints. So you could band together with some of your, fellow parents if you have some of the similar issues going on. And CDE typically will investigate within 60 days to reach a resolution, although some of these deadlines are currently kind of pushed out because of coronavirus. I guess next slide if we still have time, or we can move to questions.
We have 5 minutes left, so if you just go ahead and wrap up what you have to say.
Yeah,
and we have several questions.
Yeah, okay. So next is a discrimination complaint with the Office for Civil Rights. It's really about discrimination, harassment, retaliation based on disability and other protected identity. And one of the things to keep in mind is denying a child a FAPE and making it impossible for them to have equal access to education, can be considered a form of discrimination. And so Office for Civil Rights will hear some of those issues. I would say the problem with the Office for Civil Rights is that they don't have any concrete timeline. And so sometimes these cases can take forever for OCR to investigate and come out with an outcome. So just something to keep in mind. And then the last thing I wanted to cover, next slide, was the uniform complaint procedure, which is a complaint directly to the school district. If you're a 504 student, you do have to kind of make a first stop and do a uniform complaint procedure with the school district before you can appeal something up to the California Department of Education. One thing that I do want to keep in mind is that under what's called a Williams complaint, which is a subset of uniform complaint, is you can file complaints about lack of access to textbooks or other educational materials, and that can include access to technology. And so if you are having no access to technology, no access to educational materials during distance learning, and you want to file a local complaint with your school district, this is the mechanism by which you could do that. And the school district has a 60-day timeline to investigate. Next page. So I've included a list of helpful resources, links to Office for Civil Rights, Office of Administrative Hearings, information from CDE on the uniform complaint process. I would encourage you to take a look at that. Disability Rights California has a COVID resource page, which covers a lot of issues that may be impacting your families, including things like healthcare, housing, etc., and as well as education. So I would encourage you to check that out. We're actually in the process of trying to include some more resources for parents on our education page, so that we will be updating it as we move forward. And yeah, and then we have our intake line. If you really want to talk to an attorney or advocate about your individual issues, you can definitely reach out and contact our intake line to discuss your case.
Thank you very much, panelists, for all this very rich information. I appreciate everything you brought. I know that we could probably talk 3 or 4 hours easily on each one of these subjects, so thank you for trying to condense it. For people, thank you everyone who put questions into the chat. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but if you submit them to an email address we'll show you at the end, we'll do our best to get back to you in writing. Thank you, Pip, for showing that up. But there was a few questions about documenting and recording Zoom sessions. And if you refer to the chat, Lilian provided a detailed answer there. The next question is, what if we did private supports because we were waiting on services that were not coming and wanted to avoid regression? Is there any possibility for comp ed for something already done? And they said, we told the people we were doing this, we didn't get permission, we just did it.
Yeah. In that situation, it definitely makes sense to do some kind of written notice that you will be, seeking these outside private services and then coming back later to seek reimbursement or other compensatory services. So that's something that definitely, we've seen case law about. In other situations where people put, where people get private tutoring or put their kid in a private school and then come back to the school district to seek reimbursement. Really, the key is you do have to notify the school district and give them notice, give them a chance to cure, to fix the situation. That's something that the judge will definitely take into consideration if you ever try to appeal it.
Okay.
I would just add very quickly that I have seen a few families try to address that, usually not because it's going to hearing, but just with their own special ed administrator. Like, look, I let you know, you didn't tell me that I needed to put my request in notice, in the form of a notice, but this is what I ended up doing. Here's my receipts. Can we talk? And depending on the district and the situation, sometimes people will work with you. So, it's always worth asking, but it's, the best thing that you can ever do is put things in writing in advance before you make decisions.
Okay, thank you. So unfortunately, we've run out of time and we still have some unanswered questions, but if you will feel free to email those questions and we'll do our best to get back to you in writing, that would be great. Once again, thank you to all the panelists who shared their insights and expertise. We really appreciate you joining us. And also thank you to the interpreters and captioners who worked with us today. And again, to the Family Voices staff who brought this to you, and a special thanks to the funders of the Health Summit. Thank you very much. Our last little bit is that we have an evaluation that we'll be sending out to you at the close of this webinar. And it's really important for us to get the feedback from you, for us to be able to keep on being attuned with what you need and to improve our offerings, and also to be able to share that information with funders to be able to ask for continued funding. So we're counting on you to help us by completing the evaluation, which will help us with that. And we're at time. It's 2:16, so thank you, everybody. And again, I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but if you will please email them to the address that is on this closing screen, that would be great. We've had several questions about accessing the slides. These slide decks will be available on the Family Voices of California website. We've also put the address to Google Docs that you could download right now if you want to. So thank you so much for sharing an hour and 15 minutes of your Friday with us. We hope this information has been helpful, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.